Hey everyone. Tonight, we're drifting back to a slower world. A world where comfort came not from central heating, but from how tightly you wedge moss between the cracks of your walls. So if your blankets are pulled up and your eyes are beginning to grow heavy, just let's settle in together. We're going to spend the evening talking about something very boring, very wooden, and strangely comforting: log cabins and the peculiar men who built them. Now, I know you've probably seen them on postcards or in children's books, all quaint and rustic, smoke curling from the chimney like the ghost of a warm meal. But for the people who actually lived in them, it wasn't quite that romantic. Building a log cabin in the early American wilderness was, to put it mildly, an exercise in controlled suffering. It was like camping forever, except your campsite was slowly trying to kill you. The mountain men, those shaggy, semi-mythical figures of early America, knew this all too well. They weren't mountain men in the modern sense, with Gore-Tex jackets and subscription coffee. They were men who owned, at best, one shirt, one gun, and one or two functioning teeth. And yet somehow, these wandering misfits became the great professors of primitive architecture. Because when you're 1,000 miles from anything resembling civilization, the difference between a rustic aesthetic and a functional shelter becomes quite literal. Life or frostbite. Let's start at the beginning. Not of log cabins themselves, which date back far earlier in Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, but the American myth of them. The settlers who moved westward didn't invent the idea of stacking logs. They borrowed it, mostly from Swedish and Finnish immigrants who'd been stacking them since the Middle Ages. These northern Europeans brought with them a skill set that would have looked almost magical to the average English colonist. People who thought a hammer was mostly decorative. The Swedes showed them how to notch a log so it wouldn't roll away, how to peel bark to keep out bugs, how to fit corners so tight you could barely slide a prayer through the gaps. Of course, the Englishmen saw this and said, "Ah, splendid, we'll take it from here," and immediately simplified it until it barely worked. It's a recurring theme in history. Someone spent centuries perfecting a technique, and the British immediately adapt it by removing all the parts that function. But we'll get there later. The early mountain men, the ones who wandered into the Rockies or the Sierra Nevadas in the early 1800s, weren't trained carpenters. They were trappers, drifters, deaders, and men who'd lost arguments with society. Some were former soldiers. Others were simply running from their own pasts. Yet, when faced with long winters and wolves, they found themselves forced into a new kind of education. The wilderness became their classroom and the log cabin their thesis. Now, building a log cabin sounds easy, in the same way that making a souffle sounds easy when you've never tried it. You just chop down some trees, stack them, and voila, house. Except, of course, that trees are round, and gravity hates optimism. So unless you know how to cut notches at interlock just so, you'll end up with what early pioneers called a pile of ambition, which is to say, a future ruin. The mountain men learned, often through failure, that a good cabin begins long before you lift an axe. It begins with choosing the right trees. You needed straight ones, the straighter the better, because curved logs make your walls resemble a drunk's handwriting. You'd want pine or spruce if you could get it. Soft enough to cut, but strong enough to stand. Oak was excellent, but your arms would likely detach before your cabin took shape. They also knew the importance of drying. Freshly felled trees, green wood, will shrink and warp as they dry. So if you built too quickly, your walls would settle into strange, yawning gaps by the first snow. A cabin could literally sigh itself apart overnight. So the mountain men learned patience, or rather, they were forced into it by nature's indifference. And here's the part that modern builders rarely remember. A log cabin isn't built for perfection. It's built for survival. You don't aim for symmetry. You aim for something that won't collapse while you're sleeping. The corners might not align. The roof might leak a little. But as long as it keeps out the wind and gives you a place to hang your wet boots, it's enough. That sense of enough, of being content with what works rather than what looks good, is something we seem to have lost. Today, we measure worth in sleek finishes and color palettes. The mountain men measured it in how many nights they could last without frostbite. What they understood, and what we've mostly forgotten, is that shelter is a conversation with the environment. You don't conquer nature, you bargain with it. The cabin wasn't defiance. It was negotiation. You said, "Look, I'll take this patch of clearing. I'll stay small and quiet. I'll burn only what I need. Please don't kill me." And most winters, nature said, "Fine, for now." Let's drift over to the idea of comfort, such as it was. Inside those early cabins, interior design was not a concept. You had a dirt floor if you were lucky. If you were unlucky, you had a muddy one. The furniture was whatever you could whittle before sundown, and the decor was mostly soot. Yet to the men who'd been sleeping under the open sky, this was luxury. The crackle of fire, the creak of the roof in the wind, these were lullabies. There's something deeply human about that, how little it takes for a person to start calling something home. Of course, these men were not poets. If they waxed lyrical, it was usually about whiskey. But through the simple, repetitive act of shaping logs, they built something enduring. Not just cabins, but a cultural idea that simplicity, though rough, can be good. They didn't frame it as philosophy. They just lived it. When you live alone in the mountains long enough, surrounded by wood, you begin to understand that the line between civilized and comfortable is mostly invented. The irony, of course, is that modern people now pay millions of dollars to recreate this exact lifestyle, albeit with hot tubs and Wi-Fi. We call it rustic luxury, which is a phrase that would have made an old mountain man choke on his pipe. He'd probably just look around your tastefully distressed wooden beams and ask, "Why'd you build a barn you can't even store hay in?" Still, something in us remembers. There's a deep, almost genetic nostalgia for cabins, even among people who have no business holding an axe. It's the idea of safety, of being small and self-contained, wrapped up against the elements. We dream of it not because it was glamorous, but because it was honest. Wood fire, solitude, that's all. No decor trends, no constant renovations, no HOA fines. If you think about it, the mountain men's approach to architecture was the ultimate anti-consumerist manifesto. They didn't need imported stone countertops. They needed a roof that didn't leak. And in that humility, that stripped-down practicality, there's a kind of quiet wisdom. Maybe that's what we've forgotten, that enough warmth, enough space, and enough quiet can sometimes be all a person truly needs. Anyway, before you drift too far off, here's a little thought to settle on. If you had to build your own cabin with nothing but an axe and whatever trees you could find, how you think you'd fare? Would you make it cozy? Or would it collapse before your first cup of coffee? Tell me in the comments when you wake up. I'd love to hear how you do it. Now, let's drift onward into the next layer of wood and history, where we'll explore how the art cabin building spread and how generations of settlers misunderstood almost everything about what the mountain men had figured out. Let's drift onward through the forests and over the ridgelines to the time when the mountain began to fill with other kinds of people, the ones who came after the mountain men. Families, wagon trains, and hopeful settlers. People who believed that pioneering meant progress and that comfort could be built with haste. They were in many ways the mountain men's opposite. Tidy, ambitious, and absolutely convinced that reading a pamphlet on log construction qualified them to survive the winter. You could almost feel the difference in attitude the moment they set up camp. The mountain man's cabin was usually half hidden by trees, quiet and unassuming, like a creature that had learned not to be noticed. The settlers, on the other hand, went for visibility, clear the trees, make a big field, plant a flag. It was civilization with confidence and very little common sense. Because, of course, they forgot the first rule of the wilderness. The forest does not care about your enthusiasm. If you cleared too much land, the wind came roaring through your valley like an uninvited sermon. If you built too close to the water, the spring thaw would introduce you to the art of indoor rivers. And if you built too far from the timber, you'd spend half your life hauling firewood from somewhere you shouldn't have cleared in the first place. The mountain men had learned these lessons the hard way, through frostbite, mostly. But the settlers, well, they arrived with optimism instead of experience, and optimism, while a fine thing for writing songs, is a terrible building material. Their cabins looked impressive, at least at first. Neat rows of logs, nice square corners, a chimney that stood straight and proud. But under that fresh pine scent, you could smell the mistakes. The logs were too green. They'd shrink come winter. opening cracks big enough to host entire weather systems. The roof was too flat, perfect for collecting snow until it collapsed. And the windows, those proud, glass-paned windows, were fine until you realize glass doesn't keep out cold nearly as well as a thick wall of moss and despair. Still, they built, because what else was there to do? When the sun dipped behind the pines and the wolves began their nightly choir practice, the idea of any walls at all felt like salvation. You'd see men working by lantern light, sweat steaming in the chill air, hammering together their dream of stability before the first frost. And sometimes, just sometimes, it worked. A cabin held. The smoke curled upward in peace, the hearth glowed, and a family gathered close under quilts that smelled faintly of damp pine and hope. But more often, something gave way. A roof beam cracked, a wall sagged, a fire spread a little too far. The wilderness, polite as ever, just waited to reclaim what was borrowed. What's interesting and maybe a little sad is how quickly the settlers forgot what the mountain men understood instinctively, that a cabin isn't about conquering nature, but cooperating with it. The old trappers knew to leave certain trees standing, not just for firewood next year, but because they broke the wind and shaded the snowmelt. They knew where to face the door, how to build into a slope, how to let the forest itself become part of the home's defense. They learned to listen before they built. The settlers, bless them, listened mostly to each other, and to whatever man with a clipboard seemed most confident that week. Of course, the settlers' problem wasn't just ignorance. It was pride. You see it in every age. The moment people believe they've advanced, they stop asking questions of the ones who survive longer. So instead of learning from trappers or the native nations who've been building efficient, season-proof homes for centuries, they decided to invent a whole new frontier architecture. It involved nails, lots of nails because they look like progress, and straight lines because they look like civilization. The result was charming, in the way an ambitious child's drawing of a horse is charming, recognizable, but fundamentally unstable. Cabins went up faster than ever, and came down with equal enthusiasm. But not all were doomed. A few settlers listened. They watched how older cabins sank slightly into ground, how the mountain men laid stone on the first row of logs to keep out rot, how every joint had a logic, even when it looked rough. They copied what worked rather than what looked neat. And slowly, a new generation of frontier builders emerged, a blend of old skill and new stubbornness. By the mid-1800s, the log cabin had become a kind of national symbol, not just a building, but a myth, America's humble beginning, rendered in pine and folklore. Politicians bragged about being born in a log cabin, as if the structure itself granted moral authority. It became shorthand for honesty, hard work, and, conveniently, poor childhoods. Even William Henry Harrison, who came from considerable wealth, rebranded himself as the log cabin candidate. His campaign sold hard cider in little barrel mugs, promising voters that he was a simple man of the woods. He wasn't, of course. He lived in a mansion, but in politics, as in carpentry, appearance mattered more than function. Still, there's something revealing in that nostalgia. Even as cities rose and iron rails stretched across the country, people longed for the simplicity of those cabins, not for the cold or the labor, but for the idea that one could still carve a home directly out of the world, that comfort could come from your own hands rather than from money or machinery. If you've ever been in a true old cabin, not a Paul's vacation rental, but one still half-leaning, still breathing the scent of its forest, you can feel it. The walls seem to hold stories in the grain, low murmurs of human persistence. A log that's seen 50 winters carries a kind of quiet authority. You touch it, and it feels alive, as if the tree hasn't quite finished its life. Just changed jobs. The mountain men knew that feeling well. They often reused logs from older, collapsed cabins, recycling not out of environmental concern but practicality. Yet, in doing so, they built continuity. A cabin born from another cabin, shelter layered on shelter, a quiet, accidental ancestry. The settlers didn't always see that. To them, old meant useless. But to the ones who stayed long enough, who weathered the seasons and the disappointments, a slow understanding crept in. The forest gives and it takes, and if you're lucky, it lets you borrow its bones for a while. There's another thing we've lost, the slowness of it all. A cabin wasn't a weekend project. Even the most determined builder couldn't rush the process. You had to let the logs settle, had to wait out storms, had to listen to the rhythm of weather. You built in partnership with time. Today, we hire speed, prefabricated walls, power tools, 2-day delivery. We've engineered patience right out of the equation. But when you remove patience, you also remove intimacy. You stop knowing the grain of the wood, the weight of beam, the smell of sap as it seeps into your gloves. You stop understanding the thing you live inside. Maybe that's what the mountain men understood best. Not the engineering, but the companionship of wood. They built with trees they cut themselves, slept inside the scent of them, burned the scraps for warmth. Their lives were wrapped, quite literally, in the forest. To them, a cabin wasn't just protection. It was participation. Every creak of the timber reminded them they were part of the same cycle. And when you think of it like that, it's oddly beautiful. These were men who didn't write poetry, yet their lives became it. Rough, unrefined, but full of rhythm. They carved their survival into the world, one axe stroke at a time, until even their mistakes looked intentional. It's easy now to romanticize that. We do it all the time, in books, in films, in cozy Pinterest boards labeled cabin dreams. We see the firelight, not the frostbite. But maybe that's fine. Maybe every generation needs a myth of simplicity to balance the chaos of its comforts. The trick, I think, is remembering that those myths came from hard-won truths. The mountain men and the settlers who finally learned their lessons weren't chasing aesthetic. They were chasing survival, and in that chase, they stumbled upon meaning. So next time you see a log cabin, maybe in a museum, maybe in the woods, look closely at the corners. See how each notch fits into the next, how the wood darkens where hands once brushed against it. Those marks are a kind of history, too. Not the kind you read, but the kind that holds you up. And as you drift tonight, maybe picture the sound of it. The slow pop of fire, the sigh of pine smoke in cold air, the quiet weight of a roof built by tired hands. There's comfort in that simplicity, even if we no longer live it. Because deep down, we all want the same thing those mountain men did. A place where the wind can rattle and the world can howl. But inside, there's still warmth. Before we drift further, let me ask, if you had to live for 1 year in a true log cabin without modern tools, could you do it? Would you last through winter? Or would you find yourself trading your axe for a space heater by the first snow? Let me know in the comments when you wake up. I promise no judgment, only mild amusement. Now let's drift onward. By the middle of the 19th century, the log cabin had done something extraordinary. It had become sentimental, which is a funny fate for something made almost entirely of blisters and splinters. You see, when a frontier tool stops being useful, it often turns into a metaphor. The same men who once cursed their leaky roofs and frozen floors later began to tell stories about the good old days, days filled with honest work, strong backs, and moral clarity. Memory has a way of sanding off the rough edges. It forgets the mold and remembers the sunlight through the cracks. So by the time the country had begun building railroads and telegraph lines, people were already getting nostalgic for the world they'd just escaped. The log cabin, once a symbol of hardship, became a symbol of purity. It stood for realness, for self-reliance, for a version of humanity that didn't yet have factories or complicated taxes. And nothing sells faster than a good story about the real past, especially people living very comfortably in the present. Politicians saw this and pounced. We mentioned William Henry Harrison earlier, the log cabin and hard cider candidate. He didn't just adopt the image, he weaponized it. His supporters built actual log cabins on parade floats, rolled them through cities, and handed out mugs of cider like moral credentials. The message was simple. He's one of you, a simple man born in humble timber, which was technically true if humble means his father was a wealthy Virginia planter. But the image stuck and it worked. People love a rustic lie if it makes them feel virtuous. After that, everyone wanted a cabin in their origin story. Abraham Lincoln was genuinely born in one, and that fact followed him through every campaign. Honest Abe wasn't just a man, he was a log cabin in human form. He embodied the fantasy that anyone, no matter how rough the beginning, could rise to greatness, provided they chopped enough wood along the way. It's fascinating how architecture became morality. To be from a cabin was to be pure. To be from a city was to be suspect. It was as if wooden walls absorbed virtue by osmosis. The more rustic the structure, the more trustworthy its occupant. Of course, this moral geography made little sense. The mountain men, if resurrected, would have laughed themselves hoarse at the idea that cabins made people good. Most of them were loners, fugitives, or professional trouble magnets. But myth doesn't care about truth. It only needs a strong image and a simple story. And the cabin offered both small, sturdy, picturesque, and safe. By the late 1800s, when the last of the wilderness was being carved into farms and towns, the log cabin had completed its transformation from necessity to nostalgia. Writers, painters, and early photographers began to fixate on it. The quiet dignity of a cabin in snow, smoke curling from a chimney, the inevitable raccoon pose somewhere photogenic. The cabin became shorthand for authenticity. If your story began in one, people believed it had heart. Even if the rest of your life took place in a marble house, the cabin was proof that your roots were good. It's an irony we still live with. The further we move from the frontier, the more we seem to romanticize it. There's a comfort in imagining that once people were simple, that there was a time before complication, before the noise of the modern world. And the cabin is the perfect prop for that fantasy. Small enough to feel personal, old enough to feel wise, quiet enough to feel spiritual. But the truth, as usual, was messier. Most frontier cabins were temporary. They weren't meant to last generations. They were a start. Families built them quickly, lived in them for a few years, then replaced them with something sturdier when they could. The old cabin in the woods we picture now was often abandoned before the children were grown. In reality, it was a stepping stone, not a shrine. Still, memory has its own logic. As the frontier closed, people began to build fake cabins, commemorative ones. Historical societies reconstructed them for tourists. Schools taught children to make paper log cabins in craft class. Everyone seemed eager to hold on to the symbol of rough virtue, even as the last genuine examples rotted away quietly under the trees. It's almost poetic in a sleepy way, how people mourn what they no longer need. Once we invented central heating, we missed the sound of crackling wood. Once we had cities, we missed the silence of forests. The cabin became our emotional souvenir, proof that we were once innocent, or at least once cold in a wholesome way. You can see this nostalgia crystallize in early 20th century America. Magazines began publishing rustic retreat plans, simple vacation homes for city families who wanted to return to nature on weekends. Of course, these cabins had screened windows, indoor plumbing, and eventually electricity. They were log cabins in costume, pure theater. But it didn't matter. People wanted the illusion of simplicity, not the inconvenience of it. Even architects, they started designing Adirondack lodges, which were basically cabins that had eaten too many other cabins. Enormous, lavish, and entirely handcrafted by other people. It was wilderness gentrified. Still, the aesthetic persisted, and to this day, it hasn't left us. We still build cabins that could host a small conference because we're addicted to the feeling of simple living, even when it's very expensive to achieve. What's funny and a little sad is how the myth folded back on itself. The cabin, born of necessity, turned into a symbol of status. To own one meant you had enough comfort to pretend you didn't need it. The very idea that once meant survival now meant escape from the modern world, from noise, from people. The cabin returned not as home, but as therapy. And maybe that's all right. Maybe we need that. Because somewhere beneath the nostalgia and the designer blankets, there's still something true about that urge. To build something small, to simplify, to step outside the swirl of things. Even if our version involves a Wi-Fi password, you could argue that the myth of the log cabin is less about wood and more about longing. Longing for control, for peace, for self-sufficiency. The mountain men didn't think in those terms, of course. They built because they had to. But in doing so, they created something we keep chasing. The fantasy that we could be enough with less. That the world could quiet down if we just built a little house in the trees. And it's funny, isn't it? Every generation invents its own, simpler time, conveniently located just before they were born. In the 1800s, people missed the 1700s. In the 1900s, they missed the 1800s. Now, we miss the 1900s, when phones were attached to walls, and with smoke was the only notification. It's always the same dream, that there was once a moment when life made sense. And the cabin sits in the middle of that dream, quietly glowing. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the hum of it. Not a machine's hum, but a living one, with expanding, contracting, settling into itself. It's the sound of time moving slowly, in no particular hurry. A reminder that the world used to have seasons instead of schedules. So maybe that's why the image endures, because it whispers a small, believable lie, that we could still, if we really wanted, go back. That we could cut the noise, stack the logs, light the fire, and live honestly again. It's a comforting fiction, even if most of us would last about 2 days before missing indoor plumbing. And that's fine. There's a kind of peace in the wanting. Even if we never go, the mountain men wouldn't recognize our version of their lives. They'd probably laugh, shake their heads, and ask why our axes are decorative. But maybe they'd understand the deeper part, the need to feel small and safe again. To hear the wind outside and know, for once, it can't touch you. So next time you see a rustic cabin listed for rent, with candles and faux fur blankets and a detox from technology slogan, don't roll your eyes too hard. It's just another chapter in the same long story. Humans pretending simplicity can be bought, while quietly hoping it can still be felt. And maybe, just maybe, when the lights are low and the wood creaks and the night settles in around you, that old feeling comes back for a moment. That quiet gratitude for shelter, that small, steady rhythm of being alive and warm. Before you drift off, I'll leave you with this thought. If you had to choose between a modern apartment and a cabin deep in the woods, but you could only have one for the rest of your life, which would you pick? Be honest. Tell me in the comments when you wake up. I have a feeling most of us would choose the cabin, as long as someone else cuts the firewood. By the early 1900s, the wilderness had mostly been tamed, or at least packaged. Railroads stretched across the continent, telegraph lines threaded through the hills, and most of the forests that once swallowed men whole were now being measured, cataloged, and logged in a more bureaucratic way. The log cabin, that stubborn little shelter of necessity, should have vanished. There was no practical reason to build one anymore. And yet, somehow it multiplied, not in the mountains, but in catalogs. Companies like Sears began selling kit cabins, entire homes that arrive by train, ready to assemble. Each board numbered, each log pre-cut. You didn't even need to know how to notch a corner. The industrial age had kindly done it for you. It was a mass production of self-reliance, the paradox of simple living, conveniently prepackaged, and people loved it. There's something irresistibly American about buying a feeling of authenticity in a box. It meant you could have the look of roughness without the discomfort, the aesthetics of struggle without the frostbite. A new form of nostalgia was born, one that smelled faintly of varnish and fresh paint. Of course, there were still those who sought the real thing. Writers and artists began to retreat into the woods, often with more enthusiasm than practical skill. Thoreau had done it earlier, of course. His Walden cabin became the prototype for every romantic escape that followed. But Thoreau had the advantage of proximity. He built his wilderness retreat within walking distance of home-cooked meals from his mother, not quite the rugged image it later became. Still, he set the tone. Solitude was purity, and with walls were wisdom. By the 1920s and 30s, the back-to-nature movement was in full swing. Urban life was noisy, industrial, and stressful. The cabin, meanwhile, represented the opposite: quiet authenticity, a return to the primal. It was an antidote to modernity, sold through postcards and camp brochures. And like all antidotes, it worked best if you didn't look too closely at the ingredients. National parks began to appear. Vast tracts preserved land where urban families experienced the wilderness in controlled weekend-sized dose. The irony was delicious. People traveled hundreds of miles to stand in line for a campsite, to sleep in a cabin built by someone else, and to tell themselves they were roughing it. The mountain men, had they been around, would have had questions. But even cynics must admit something beautiful happened in that era. For the first time, ordinary people began to value wilderness not as an obstacle, but as a refuge. The cabin became the symbol of that shift, a small, human space within something vast and untamed, a border post between civilization and silence. You can still see echoes of that romanticism in the photographs of the time. Families posed proudly on rough porches, children in overalls, the inevitable dog looking slightly confused. These weren't trappers or pioneers anymore. They were vacationers. But their smiles tell you everything. For a few days, they got to pretend they were part of something simpler, even if the car was parked just out of frame. Then came the 1950s, the decade of convenience. Washing machines, televisions, suburban lawns trimmed within an inch of their lives. Comfort became king. And yet, in the midst of all that order, people began to feel strangely restless. You could have everything, a mortgage, a sedan, a refrigerator that glowed in the dark, and still feel like something essential was missing. The response? Cabins again. Only now, they were marketed as vacation homes, a place to get away from your comfort, so you could properly appreciate it when you returned. It's an odd loop, really, escaping comfort by recreating discomfort in a comfortable way. You drive out to the woods on Friday, light a pre-stacked fire, roast marshmallows on a perfectly safe stick, and tell stories about the wild frontier while your radio played soft jazz. It was survival as leisure, the wilderness experience, with optional electrical outlets. And maybe that's when we fully lost the plot, because what the mountain men understood was that their cabins weren't escapes. They were commitments. You didn't go there to get away. You went there because there was nowhere else. The cabin wasn't a weekend home. It was the home. Every plank mattered. Every draft had consequences. It wasn't charming. It was alive. Modern cabins, for all their charm, became more like stage sets. Perfect lighting, perfect symmetry, a curated version of simplicity. And when something broke, you called maintenance. There's a quiet tragedy in that. We kept the image, but lost the intimacy. By the late 20th century, this contradiction had matured into a full-blown aesthetic industry. Stores sold rustic furniture, brand new tables that looked aggressively weathered. You could buy lamps shaped like old lanterns and blankets that looked hand-woven, but weren't. Everything was a performance of authenticity. The log cabin had evolved from shelter into style. And yet, somewhere in that imitation, the original yearning still glowed faintly. Even if we couldn't live simply, we wanted to believe we could feel simple. Then came the environmental movements, a softer voice in the modern roar. Suddenly, the cabin wasn't just nostalgic. It was sustainable. Architects started designing eco-lodges and off-grid retreats. Solar panels appeared where moss once grew. Rainwater systems replaced wooden buckets. The goal was noble, to reconnect with nature, to live lightly. But even then, technology crept in quietly, like ivy on an old wall. You could monitor your water tank through an app. You could heat your cabin with a smart thermostat. You could be alone in the woods and still answer emails. The mountain men would have been bewildered, not disapproving necessarily, just confused. They built their cabins as fortresses against the world. We build ours with Wi-Fi. Still, there's something enduring about the urge. No matter how industrial, digital, or detached life becomes, people keep circling back to the same idea. A small wooden house, surrounded by quiet, with just enough firelight to feel human. It's comforting in a way that the image never dies, because it means we still recognize, even dimly, that the modern world doesn't satisfy everything. We still crave slowness and silence, and the sense that our hands could still make something that lasts. Even if we have to Google how. If you drive through mountain towns today, you'll see both versions of the log cabin standing side by side. The ancient, sagging ones, gray with weather, roof patched with tin, and the shiny new ones, all varnished in symmetry. The old cabins lean quietly, breathing history through their cracks. The new ones smile too hard, all straight lines and clean decks. But both, in their own way, represent the same longing, to belong to a place, not just exist in it. Maybe that's why the myth persists so stubbornly. because it offers an answer to a question we can't quite stop asking. What would life look like if it were just a little simpler? Of course, we never actually want to find out. The thought is enough. The dream itself is a shelter. And yet, somewhere out there, in some quiet clearing, someone still builds a real cabin. Not for Instagram, not for guests, but because they want to live inside something they made with their own hands. They cut the logs, they lift the beams, they chink the gaps with moss and patience. And when the first snow falls, they hear that sound, the deep, content sigh with settling, and they know they've built something honest. It's rare now, but it still happens. And maybe that's enough. Because as long as someone somewhere is still stacking logs in the cold, the memory of what we once understood doesn't die completely. So tonight, as you drift off, maybe picture that cabin again. Not the glossy vacation one, but the real kind. The one that creaks and breathes and smells faintly of smoke. Imagine the warmth of the fire, the soft flicker against the walls, the quiet hum of being alive in a world that's briefly still. That's what they knew. That's what we forgot. Before you sleep, I'll leave you a gentle question. If you could spend one full year in that kind of quiet, just you, a cabin, and the seasons, do you think you'd find peace? Or would the silence start talking back? Tell me in the comments when you wake up. Now let's drift onward. Hey there, still awake? Or half drifting, like smoke curling up into the rafters? That's fine either way. Tonight, we're sailing back through time, before the American wilderness, before beaver pelts and trading posts, to the old world, to the cold forest in north of Europe, where people didn't just build with logs, they lived in them. Picture it, a gray horizon, pines standing like sentinels, the kind of landscape that makes you instinctively pull your cloak tighter. This was Scandinavia, several centuries before anyone thought to call themselves a pioneer. Long before the word cabin existed in English, it existed here, not as a style, not as nostalgia, but as survival carved from the forest itself. The first log houses in northern Europe were small and sturdy, because they had to be. Winters didn't play around in those latitudes. The trees grew slow and dense, the air bit through wool, and the wind came howling off the sea like a living thing. People built with what they had. Wood. Lots of it. Not milled, not plain, not decorated. Just stripped and stacked, log upon log, until the forest became shelter. They learned early that if you notched the corners right, cutting deep saddle joints so one log sat neatly atop another, the structure could withstand almost anything. Rain, snow, even the occasional bear that wandered too close. You could hear the weather outside, but it couldn't reach you. That a powerful feeling, being safe in a world that mostly isn't. And that's the ancient beauty of it. The knowledge that the same trees surrounding you could also protect you. There's a kind of poetic practicality there. The cabin wasn't just a building. It was a truce between human and forest. In the Norse sagas, there are mentions of timber halls and simple huts. They were rarely glamorous, but they were warm. And in a world where cold killed more surely than war, warmth was the highest luxury. Even the Vikings, those famously restless sailors, built log dwellings when they stayed ashore. They used whole pine trunks, notched and interlocked, sealed with moss and animal fat. No nails, no glue, just weight and geometry. You could take a cabin apart and rebuild it somewhere else, a kind of ancient IKEA. Except this furniture could survive a blizzard. When the weather turned cruel, they'd light the hearth and sit in the dim glow of smoke and embers. The air inside would fill with the scent of pine resin and roasted fish. And if you listen closely in imagination, you can almost hear the murmur of Norse voices, the soft clinking of wooden bowls, the steady crackle with adjusting to the heat. What they knew, and what we forgot, was that the cabin wasn't just an object. It was a rhythm. It followed the seasons. It grew colder, then warmer, then creaked as the log swelled and shrank. It aged with the people inside it. The walls darkened from smoke. The floorboard softened under the same feet, year after year. It became part of the family, and eventually part of the soil again. When settlers later crossed the Atlantic and started building log cabins in the New World, they brought this knowledge with them. The techniques came mostly from Scandinavia and Finland, from people who had been working with wood for centuries, who understood it like kin. Every joint, every groove, every angle of light through the window had meaning. But over there in the old countries, things were changing. The forests were shrinking, and stone began to replace wood in cities. Yet in the countryside, in the hidden valleys of Sweden, the birch forests of Finland, and the cold reaches of Russia, the old way endured. If you wander those places even now, you can still find cabins built hundreds of years ago, standing with quiet defiance. The logs gray and weathered, but solid, moss thick in the cracks, roofs sagging a little under the weight of time. They look tired, but dignified, like elders of the landscape, still holding stories in their walls. And those stories are wonderfully ordinary. Births, deaths, long winters, too much rye bread. The kind of history that doesn't make it into textbooks, but lingers in the grain of the wood. You can almost imagine one of those old builders, a farmer maybe, or a fisherman, pausing mid-swing of the axe to squint at the horizon and think, this'll do. Then he'd go back to work, because it always had to get done before the snow came. That was the unspoken truth of cabin life. There was no pause button, no weekend project. The roof didn't wait. The stove didn't clean itself. You lived and worked in the same heartbeat. And because of that, every act of building was an act of faith, that you'd still be there tomorrow to enjoy what you made. You might be wondering, were these cabins cozy? In a sense, yes, but not in the way we think of cozy now. They were smoky, dim, and often damp. The windows, if there were any, were covered with animal skin or thin sheets of horn instead of glass. The floors were packed dirt. The furniture was whatever you could whittle before your hands froze. But inside, the air was alive. You could feel the pulse of the fire and the faint vibration of the storm outside. You were inside the world, not apart from it. That kind of closeness changes you. It teaches humility, a word modern architecture rarely uses. The old builders didn't design for aesthetics. They designed for endurance. Beauty happened by accident, through necessity. The symmetry of hand-hewn logs, the warmth of wood grain, the light filtering through smoke, all was unplanned and therefore perfect. There's a kind of wisdom in that simplicity. Modern homes often try to recreate that feeling with fake beams and rustic decor, but you can always sense the difference. The old cabins were built with gratitude. Gratitude to the forest, to the sun, to the stubbornness that kept people alive through endless winters. Every notch and groove was earned. As Christianity spread northward, even churches began borrowing the style. Some of the earliest wooden churches in Norway, the famous stave churches, were essentially log cabins that had been promoted to holiness. The same construction methods, interlocking beams, no nails, were elevated into art. Dragons were carved along the eaves, as if the old pagan spirits refused to vacate quietly. It's strange, isn't it? How something so humble could become sacred. But maybe it makes sense. The log cabin was always a kind of prayer, a shelter built in gratitude for survival. The stave church just made that sentiment official. Meanwhile, far to the east, in Russia, the same idea took on its own grandeur. Peasant huts, called izbas, dotted the landscape, low. Smoky dwellings made of spruce or larch, their corners thick and interlocked. Over time, they became central to rural life, places of warmth and storytelling. And as Russian carpenters grew more skilled, those same log-building techniques were used to construct cathedrals, towering wooden structures that seemed to defy gravity. So you see, the log cabin wasn't born from one culture or one time. It was humanity's shared answer to the same eternal question. How do we stay warm, safe, and connected in a world that doesn't particularly care if we survive? That's what the mountain men inherited. Even if they didn't know it, every cabin they built in the Rockies or the Appalachians carried within it the memory of these northern ancestors. The rhythm of axe and chisel, the patience of stacking, the reverence for timber, it was all the same story, retold across continents. And it's easy to romanticize, I know. It's tempting to imagine that life back then was somehow simpler or purer, but simplicity has a cost. For every warm hearth, there were frozen fingers. For every glowing window, there were nights when the wolves came too close. But somehow, the cabins endured, and so did the people. Maybe that's why, even now, When we feel overwhelmed by screens and deadlines, we find ourselves dreaming of wooden walls and flickering fires. Somewhere deep in our memory, buried under centuries of progress, the instinct remains: build something solid and sit quietly inside it. If you ever visit Scandinavia or Finland and wander into one of their open-air museums, you can step inside these ancient structures. The air smells faintly of pine and history. The walls are dark, polished by generations of hands. The silence inside feels thick, not empty, but full, as if the space itself remembers every word ever spoken within it. It's a powerful thing, standing in a room made entirely of trees that once grew outside. It feels alive because it is, and as you breathe that slow, resin-scented air, you realize something the mountain men probably knew too, that a cabin isn't built from the forest. It's built with it. There's a difference. So the next time you see a log cabin, whether in an old photo, a national park, or your favorite overly filtered Instagram post, remember where it came from. 1,000 years of cold nights and careful hands. A lineage of quiet builders who asked for nothing more than warmth and time. It's not a bad legacy, really. Better than most of what we'll leave behind. And as we drift towards sleep, let me ask you this. If you had to build your own shelter, with your own hands, in the middle of nowhere, do you think you'd manage? Or would you, like most of us, end up politely asking the forest for Wi-Fi first? Tell me in the comments tomorrow. I'll be reading them by lantern light. Now, let's drift onward. Hey, everyone. Still here, still half awake. Perfect. Because now we're sailing into one of those slow, gray Atlantic crossings that define the early centuries of European settlement. The kind where time stretches, where the sea and sky trade colors, and where homesickness begins before you've even seen your destination. When the first settlers left Scandinavia, Germany, and the British Isles of the New World, they carried many things: seeds, tools, faith, and, perhaps most enduringly, memory. Among those memories was the knowledge of wood, of how to shape it, how to trust it, how to let it carry you through a winter that wanted you dead. In the forests of Pennsylvania, Virginia, and the Carolinas, the new arrivals found an embarrassment of timber. Trees so tall they seemed to scrape the sky, forests dense enough to swallow entire settlements. It was overwhelming, but familiar, because they'd seen something like it before. In a way, America felt like an echo of their own northern homelands, only bigger and more indifferent. So, naturally, they did what they knew. They built log cabins. It wasn't the English settlers who started the tradition, though. The English, bless them, preferred timber-framed houses, neat little constructions with wattle and daub, the kind that made sense in the mild climate of home counties, not so much in a Pennsylvania winter. Their early attempt at houses here tended to rot, warp, or simply collapse on the first real storm. No, the log cabin came to America through the hands of the Swedes and Finns, who settled along the Delaware River in the mid-1600s. They brought the skill of corner notching and the patience of people used to long winters. Their cabins were simple: one room, dirt floor, a low roof. But they worked, and as practicality often does, the idea spread. The Germans learned it. The Scots-Irish copied it. And soon the log cabin became the universal shorthand for frontier life. You can almost picture the first ones: small, dark rectangles in a sea of green, smoke curling from a stone chimney, a patch of cleared ground around them, where trees once stood. No fences yet, no roads, just the sharp smell of sap and the endless quiet of wilderness. Those early settlers understood something we mostly don't anymore: that a cabin wasn't supposed to be perfect. It was supposed to be possible. A man and his family could build one in a few weeks if they had to. The logs didn't have to match. The corners didn't have to line up neatly, and the roof didn't need to win awards. It just had to hold. That's what made it revolutionary. You didn't need a mason or a carpenter or a permit, just an axe, a strong back, and enough stubbornness to keep swinging. There's something democratic in that. The cabin didn't care who you were. It didn't need status or wealth. In a world still obsessed with hierarchy, it was radical, a home anyone could make with their own hands. That's part of why it became such a powerful symbol in early American myth. Even presidents leaned on the imagery. Abraham Lincoln, famously, was born in a log cabin. So were Andrew Jackson, James K. Polk, and a few others who may have slightly exaggerated their rustic origins for political effect. The cabin became shorthand for humility, resilience, authenticity, even if some of those cabins were more symbolic than factual. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In those first decades, there was nothing romantic about it. Cabins were dark, smoky, and small. The cracks between logs had to be filled with mud, clay, or a mix of moss and straw, called chinking. When that dried and fell out, which inevitably did, the wind whistled through like an uninvited guest. The hearth was the heart of the cabin. Everything revolved around it. Cooking, warmth, light, survival. Families huddled close to it in winter, their faces glowing orange while the rest of the room stayed in shadow. The air inside was thick with smoke, since chimneys were often an afterthought. A hole in the roof, if you were lucky. It was a harsh kind of coziness. You didn't sip cocoa by the fire. You boiled water because it was the only way to keep the chill off your bones. And yet, there was pride in it, because each log represented effort. A tree cut, a burden lifted, a space claimed against the wilderness. The cabin was proof that you existed, that your hands could shape the world into something that kept you alive. In those days, building wasn't separate from living. It was living. Every swing of the axe was a heartbeat. Every wall was a declaration that you belonged, however temporarily, in a place that didn't really want you there. When you think about it that way, it's not surprising that people grew attached to their cabins. They weren't just shelters. They were extensions of the self, the visible evidence of willpower and faith. And there were no blueprints. Everyone built differently. Some used rough notches, others fancier dovetail joints. Some cabins had porches, others didn't. Some stood square, others leaned slightly, as if listening to the wind. Perfection didn't matter. Function did. The settlers also learned quickly that not all was created equal. Pine was soft and easy to cut, but rotted fast. Oak lasted longer, but weighed a ton. Chestnut was perfect, resistant to decay, straight-grained, but it wouldn't last forever, either. Nothing did. That was part of the understanding. Cabins aged the way people did, creaking, cracking, shifting. If you built one well, it could last a lifetime. After that, the forest would quietly reclaim it. And perhaps that's what made it sacred in its own quiet way. The cabin was always temporary. A resting place between wilderness and settlement, between chaos and civilization. It wasn't meant to last forever, only long enough. There's a humility in that, the kind modern architecture rarely tolerates. These cabins weren't monuments. They were compromises. You can still find the ghosts of them in the woods today. Tilted remnants of walls, moss-covered corners, a single chimney still standing like a memory. The trees have closed and again, erasing the edges. But if you stop and listen, you can almost hear what life sounded like there. The dull thud of an axe, the sigh of wind through gaps, the low murmur of voices sharing bread and exhaustion. It wasn't glamorous, but it was real. The people who lived in those cabins were often poor, illiterate, and perpetually tired. But they understood their environment in a way that would shame most of us. They knew which trees to fell by sound, listening for the hollow ring that meant rot inside. They knew how to angle a roof so the snow would slide, how to read the smoke to tell if the firewood was too wet. They lived by instinct, not manuals. And when they died, which happened often and early, the cabin stayed behind for a while, holding their absence like a breath, until time came for it too. There's something haunting about that image, isn't there? A structure built by hand, outlasting the hands that made it. That's what the mountain men inherited. Not just a technique, but the awareness that everything built is temporary. You build anyway. That's the quiet kind of courage we don't celebrate much anymore. By the late 1700s, cabins had begun spreading westward with the frontier, from the Alleghenies to Kentucky, then to Tennessee, then beyond. Each new family brought the same rhythm. Fell the trees, clear the land, stack the logs, make a home. The cabins became signposts of progress, each one marking the slow, stubborn advance of settlement. But progress, of course, is a slippery word. For every family finding a new home, there were others losing theirs, indigenous peoples whose lands were taken, forests cleared, and rivers dammed. The cabin stood at the heart of that contradiction, a symbol of freedom for some, displacement for others. Even so, the myth grew. The cabin became the emblem of the self-made man, the frontier dream in wooden form. By the time the 19th century rolled around, it had achieved near religious status. It wasn't just a shelter, it was ideology. And that's when the mountain men entered the story. Rugged wanderers who built their own cabins in the farthest reaches of wilderness, miles from anyone else. They inherited not just the techniques of Europe, but the philosophy of the frontier. That solitude could be strength, that silence was a kind of wealth. They may not have realized it, but they were carrying centuries of northern craftsmanship in their callous hands. The notches they cut had names that echoed back to Finland. The way they stacked logs followed a rhythm older than the colonies themselves. And somewhere between the creak of pine and the hiss of fire, they probably felt the same small, ancient comfort that their ancestors had. The peace of a solid wall between them and the wind. So, when we talk about what mountain men understood about log cabins, well, we forgot, maybe it starts here. They remembered what the cabin meant. That it wasn't just something to live in, but something to live with, a relationship, not a possession. And that's something our world, with its prefab homes and curated rustic decor, has a hard time grasping. So, as you drift off tonight, maybe picture that first frontier cabin. Not the idealized version, but the real one. Small, smoky, uneven. A place built by hands that hurt in a forest that hummed. A home that wasn't perfect and didn't need to be. Before you sleep, I'll leave you a gentle question. If you had to build your own home from what nature gave you, no power tools, no shortcuts, would you still want to? Or would you quietly decide that maybe concrete isn't so bad after all? Tell me in the comments, if you like. I promise I'll read them slowly, like counting logs at dusk. Now let's drift onward. If the early settlers built cabins to survive, the mountain men built them to disappear. They were a strange breed, part explorer, part trapper, part philosopher, though few would admit to that last part. In the early 19th century, when the rest of the world was starting to hum with industry and progress, these men turned their backs to it. They packed their rifles, traps, and flints and walked west, past the farms, past the rivers, into the cold spine of the Rockies. Some went for profit, to trap beavers and sell their pelts to fur companies back east. But many, perhaps most, went for something they couldn't name. Freedom, solitude, escape? Pick your word. It all came down to the same thing. They wanted to be where nobody could tell them what to do. And that's where the log cabin returned, as their one concession to civilization. Picture it. A valley between two mountains, still and endless. A creek winding through it, silver in the afternoon light. No sound but the low murmur of water and the far cry of a hawk. That's where a mountain man would stop, rest his pack, and look around with that instinctive measuring gaze. Sunlight, water, wood, shelter. All the elements in one place. Perfect. Then the real work began. First, the clearing. Always the clearing. Swing the axe, one deliberate stroke at a time. Trees falling in the slow rhythm of exhaustion and purpose. Sweat, sap, and solitude. He'd strip the bark, cut the notches, stack the logs. No fancy joinery now, just solid corners, simple lines. A roof of split shakes or sod. Chink walls, a stone hearth. Maybe one window, if he was feeling ambitious. Inside, a bed of pine boughs, a shelf for powder and lead, a peg for his rifle. Everything else was silence. That was a mountain man's home, four walls between him and the infinite. And though it sounds lonely, it wasn't, at least not in the way we think of loneliness. To live like that, you had to be at ease with yourself. Solitude wasn't isolation. It was equilibrium. The cabin became the center of that balance. You built it. You repaired it. You talked to it sometimes, not out loud, but in the way your hands remembered every groove and knot. Each log held the imprint of your labor. Each tool mark was a kind of prayer. At night, when the fire crackled low and the world outside turned to frost, the cabin hummed like a living thing. The log expanded and contracted with the temperature. The roof creaked softly under snow. The wind tested the seams. And inside, a man listened, not with fear, but with understanding, because every sound meant something. You could tell by the whistle if snow was blowing in through the chinks. You could tell by the pitch of the fire whether the wood was too green. You could tell by the silence outside whether an animal was near. This was knowledge born of necessity, the kind that doesn't come from books, only from the quiet repetition of living. In that stillness, days blurred. The seasons turned in wide, slow circles. Spring brought thaw and mud. Summer brought mosquitoes and heat. Autumn brought gold leaves and meat to smoke. Winter brought endurance. The cabin held through it all, sometimes leaning, sometimes cracking, but never complaining. It became an anchor in a world without clocks. And yet, even for men who prize solitude, the silence could grow heavy. Every so often, they'd leave their cabins and travel to rendezvous, great yearly gatherings of trappers, traders, and native allies in mountain valleys. For a few weeks, the wilderness filled with laughter, whiskey, arguments, and the sound of fiddles. They traded furs for supplies, swapped stories, and remembered briefly that they were human. Then, just as suddenly, they went back to their valleys, their streams, their cabins, back to the slow hum of solitude. Because here's the quiet truth. Once you've lived that far from the world, it's hard to go back to it. Civilization feels loud, crowded, demanding. The cabin, small, smoky, imperfect, becomes the only space that feels honest. You can still sense traces of that in the ruins left behind. There's a kind of human geometry to old cabins. The way the doorway always faces the sun, the hearth always built from local stone, the roof pitched to shed the heaviest snow. These weren't random choices. They were survival, refined into ritual. To the mountain man, building was an act of faith. Faith that the world would still be there in the morning, that the snow would melt, that the firewood would hold out. Every cabin was a quiet assertion. I'm still here. And maybe that's why so many of them were built alone, far from others. A man's cabin wasn't just a home. It was a reflection of his soul, sturdy, flawed, and fiercely independent. Some of the mountain men became legends in their own lifetimes. Jedediah Smith, the pious explorer who carried his Bible through grisly country. Jim Bridger, part philosopher, part storyteller, part weathered ghost of the plains. Hugh Glass, who crawled 200 miles after a bear attack, dragging his shattered body back to life by sheer will. Each of them lived in cabins at one point or another, though none for long. The wilderness didn't allow permanence. Rivers shifted, trails vanished. Storms took roofs, fires took walls. That was part of the unspoken lesson. You never really owned a cabin. You borrowed it from the landscape for as long as the land permitted. And when it was time to leave, whether for better hunting grounds, or because a company order came through, or because the roof finally gave up, you didn't tear it down. You just closed the door, shouldered your rifle, and walked away. The forest always knew what to do next. There's a strange beauty in that, isn't there? The quiet acceptance of impermanence. These men, rough and often brutal, carried an almost monastic humility when it came to nature. They didn't try to conquer it. They endured it. They didn't demand eternity. They settled for the present. Modern life, with all its noise and clutter, has lost that balance. We live in permanent motion, constant connection, constant distraction. But the mountain man, for all his roughness, understood something about stillness that we've long forgotten. In his cabin, there was no noise but the fire in his own breath, no light but the moon or the flame, no interruptions but the weather, and in that quiet he found a kind of peace, not comfort exactly, but clarity. It's the same kind of peace monks once described in stone cells, or sailors in the middle of the sea, the peace of being utterly small against something infinite. That's what the cabin represented to them. Not luxury, but alignment, a place where man and mountain could meet on even terms. Even now, when you visit the few preserved cabins from that era, you can feel it. Step inside and everything changes. The air is different, colder, stiller, charged with memory. The logs hold the smell of smoke that hasn't burned in a century. Dust hangs in the air like time made visible. You can almost hear boots on the floorboards, the soft thunk of a knife against wood, the slow exhale of a man sitting by the fire after a long day. There's no grandeur there, no pretense, just existence, raw and unembellished. And maybe that's why these places still haunt us. We live surrounded by noise, and yet something in us still yearns for that kind of quiet. The cabin in the woods, the escape into solitude, the fantasy of living with only what you can make or carry. It's not nostalgia, it's recognition. A reminder that simplicity once meant survival, not aesthetics. The mountain men didn't name this wisdom. They just lived it. Their cabins were built to breathe, not to impress. They didn't worry about symmetry or design. They trusted their eyes, their hands, and the seasons. They worked with what they had. And when the roof leaked, they fixed it with bark. When the fire smoked, they widened the flue. When the wall bowed, they braced it with a log. There was no manual for any of it, just memory and instinct. And perhaps that's what we've lost. Not just the craft, but the patience. The willingness to fail, fix, and keep going. So, if there's a lesson to be found in those cabins, maybe it's this: perfection isn't the goal, persistence is. Because a cabin, like a life, is never really finished. It's a series of repairs. So, as a fire in the story burns lower, imagine yourself there, inside that little mountain cabin. Snow whispering against the roof, fire casting its amber glow, a rough-hewn table in the corner, maybe a single book or journal beside your bedroll. Outside, the night is wide and silent. Inside, it's warm enough. You built this with your own hands, your own breath, your own stubborn will. It creaks. It smokes. It leaks a little when the wind hits right. But it's yours. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. When you think of a log cabin, it's easy to imagine the shape of it. The roof lying against the sky, the door made from uneven planks. But what's often forgotten is that every single piece of it was once alive. The walls were once trees. The rafters, once branches swaying in the wind. Even the fire that warmed the cabin was made from wood that had stood in silence for decades before being cut down. The mountain men knew this intimately. They couldn't afford not to. To them, trees weren't scenery. They were resources, tools, shelter, and sometimes obstacles. A forest wasn't a place you wandered into. It was a place you negotiated with. And that negotiation started with the axe. Now, the axe was more than a tool. It was a kind of handshake with the land. You carried it over your shoulder like a friend, but also like a promise. I'll take only what I need. The mountain man's axe was usually worn down to a dull gleam, the handle smoothed by years of sweat. Each swing was part calculation, part instinct. They learned to read trees the way others read faces. Leaning slightly means tension. Hollow sound means rot. Sap scent means life still running through the grain. Cutting the wrong tree at the wrong time could mean disaster. A green log was heavy, hard to shape, and warped when it dried. A dead one might crumble. You needed just the right balance, seasoned, but solid. In modern life, we rarely think about the patience that takes. But to build a cabin properly, you had to wait. You couldn't just chop and stack in a day. The logs had to rest. The ends had to dry in the shade. You had to let the wood shrink before it could be fitted together. And while it waited, so did you. That kind of patience is almost unthinkable today. We live in a world of instant fixes, with cut-to-uniform length, ready-to-build kits, even log cabin wallpaper if you want to fake it. But the mountain man had to earn every board, every notch. There's something almost meditative about that. Each stroke of the axe was slow and deliberate. The sound echoed through the valley, steady as a heartbeat. You could tell the time of day by the tone of it. Morning cuts were crisp and eager. Evening ones grew dull and tired. And then, after the cutting came the shaping, the art of fitting uneven things together. Because no two logs were ever the same. Some bowed slightly. Some flared at the ends. Some were thick as barrels. Others thin as fence posts. To make them fit, you learn compromise. You turn them, shave them, notch them until they lock together. Not perfectly, but securely. There's a quiet philosophy in that, too. You can't force wood to be straight. You can only work with what it gives you. It's the same lesson the forest kept teaching. Adaptability. Maybe that's why the cabins held up so well. They were imperfect by design, built from materials that had already survived storms and seasons. The logs expanded and shrank together, breathing with the weather. Nothing was static. Nothing was sterile. Even the chinking, the filler stuff between the logs, was alive in its own way. Clay, moss, straw, mud, whatever was handy. It dried, cracked, and had to be replaced every year. Maintenance was constant, but that too was part of the rhythm. Fixing, mending, tending, the slow, repetitive motions that made up a life. There's an almost forgotten piece in that. The mountain men, though rough and restless, found stability in those little rituals. Sharpening tools, splitting firewood, repairing cracks. They didn't call it mindfulness. They just did it because it had to be done. The logs taught them patience. The fire taught them humility. Fire, after all, was both friend and threat. One stray ember could undo months of labor. But without it, you froze. Starting a fire back then wasn't a flick of a switch. It was ceremony. Flint and steel, dry tinder, a cupped hand, a gentle breath. Smoke first, then spark, then flame. The whole process was a conversation with chance. The first warmth that filled a new cabin must have felt almost sacred. A heartbeat inside walls that had been dead but a week before. The mountain men treated their fires like living companions. They kept them small but steady, never too wild, never too low. They knew how to feed it, how to read it, when to let it rest. In a sense, the fire was a cabin soul. The logs were its bones. Together they formed a living system, a fragile harmony of fuel and breath. You can still see the wisdom of that in the ashes left behind. Archaeologists find the old hearths, the blackened stones, and the charred marks on walls. And even after 2 centuries, the pattern of the smoke tells stories. You can tell how a man lived by the soot stains above his hearth. Too much smoke meant impatience, wet wood or rush burning. A clean burn meant skill, attentiveness. In a way, every fire was a signature. When you think about it like that, a log cabin wasn't just a shelter. It was a kind of slow collaboration between man, wood, and flame. Each had its role, and each had to respect the others. The wood gave structure. The fire gave warmth. The man gave care. Remove anyone and the balance collapsed. It's almost strange how far we've drifted from that awareness. We use materials without knowing their origins. We heat our homes without touching the source of warmth. We light fires with buttons and forget that once fire was a miracle. But for the mountain men, the miracle was constant. Every time the flame caught, every time the cabin held through a storm, it was a reminder. This world doesn't owe you safety, but offers partnership if you're willing to listen. The forest wasn't an enemy or a backdrop. It was a teacher. There's a saying, passed down in different forms, that the forest speaks slowly and only to those who stay long enough to hear. The mountain men heard it, even if they couldn't put it into words. When you live among trees long enough, you start to notice the subtleties. The creak of trunks in the wind isn't random. It's communication. The way moss grows on bark tells you which way the wind moves most often. The sound of an axe echoing differently one morning might mean the air is shifted and snow is on the way. That's what the cabin builders knew. Awareness isn't knowledge. It's attention. They weren't scientists. They didn't analyze. They just noticed. That's something else we've lost. The slow noticing of the world around us. We see everything all the time through screens and shortcuts, but we rarely observe. The mountain men did. They had to. Every notch in every log was a result of observation, of trial and error, of touch and sound. And when the cabin was done, it wasn't perfect. It wasn't meant to be. Perfection was for people who could afford to start over. The mountain men couldn't. They accepted imperfection as proof of effort. That's the secret of those old structures. They lasted because they weren't rigid. Every joint had give. Every log bent a little. The building swayed with the wind instead of fighting it. Nature rewards flexibility, not strength. It's strange how easily that lesson translates into everything else. How you can see the same principle in a life, a relationship, a society. The sturdiest things are never the most brittle. The logs knew that. So did the men who swung the axes. And maybe, just maybe, that's the wisdom we forgot. Not the technique, but the temperament. You can buy tools now that do in an hour what once took a week. You can build a cabin from pre-cut panels and never touch a single tree. But you can't by the understanding that comes from slowness, the understanding that comes from rhythm, the repetitive, unhurried tasks that keep you grounded. So much of what the mountain men learned came not from discovery, but from repetition, doing the same thing day after day until the motion itself became meaning. There's something deeply human in that. Maybe that's why, even in our modern lives, we find peace in simple, repetitive acts: stirring a pot, sanding a board, folding laundry. Somewhere in our bones, we remember that rhythm, the feel of shaping the world with our hands. The mountain men just lived closer to that memory. They didn't call it philosophy. They didn't call it craftsmanship. They just called it getting by. But in that getting by, they stumbled upon something timeless, the knowledge that the world rewards those who move slowly enough to learn its texture. So tonight, as we let the story dim down to its embers, imagine the sound of a slow axe rhythm in the cold air, the thunk of steel and wood, the creak of a half-built cabin, the small fire waiting to be fed. Somewhere, a man wipes his brow and looks around at what he's made. It's not perfect. It's not even finished. But it's standing. And that's enough. When you live alone in the wilderness, every motion counts. There's no room for wasted work. You chop only what you can burn. You mend only what you'll wear again. You build only what you can keep standing. And if something can't be done before nightfall, you leave it for morning. That's the rhythm the mountain men learned, not out of choice, but necessity. We tend to romanticize their lives, imagining constant adventure and wide horizons. But most days were quiet, repetitive, and deeply practical. The work had to balance itself. If you spent too much energy on one task, something else would go undone. If you rushed, you broke things. If you rested too long, you went cold. The wilderness wasn't cruel. It was just exacting. It gave back exactly what you gave it. No more, no less. That was the mountain man's economy of effort, a kind of slow mathematics written in wood, frost, and muscle. Every decision had a cost. Felling a tree meant a day of swinging an axe, followed by another of shaping, hauling, stacking. Setting traps meant long, quiet walks through the snow. Even cooking took calculation. Every scrap of fat saved, every ember coaxed into lasting another hour. There were no luxuries of abundance. You couldn't waste time showing off or doing anything for appearance. Efficiency was survival. In a world like that, you learn to accept imperfection because perfection cost too much energy. A cabin wall that leaned a little? Fine, as long as it kept out the wind. A door that stuck? You could live with that. A roof that dripped once in a while? Put a bucket there. Because the truth was, every fix had a price in calories, daylight, and willpower. And if the problem wasn't urgent, you learned to let it be. It's a kind of wisdom we've almost forgotten, the wisdom of choosing enough. Today, we call it minimalism and post it on the internet. But to the mountain men, it was just common sense. They built things only as large as they could heat. They carried only as much as they could move in a day. They cooked only what they could eat before it spoiled. Their wealth wasn't measured in possessions, but in stamina. And stamina came from restraint. Because out there, you couldn't just buy your way out of fatigue. You had to pace yourself. The trick, as many journals from that time suggest, was in learning to notice when effort stopped being productive, when chopping one more log became counterproductive, when walking one more mile meant frostbite. The mountain men learned that limit early. They called it the line. Crossing it was dangerous. It wasn't the dramatic kind of danger, not wolves or gunfights, but the slow, creeping kind, the kind that came from ignoring your own exhaustion. And so they learned to stop before breaking, to pause without guilt. There's something soothing about that notion, the idea that rest wasn't laziness. It was maintenance, a necessary part of the day's work. We tend to forget that, don't we? In a world that glorifies productivity, rest feels like failure. But to the mountain men, it was wisdom. You sharpened tools and fed fires not because you were idle, but because you understood time as cyclical. Every pause was an investment in tomorrow. Even the rhythm of the seasons reinforced this. Winter wasn't a punishment. It was a pause, A long enforced rest where the forest reset itself, and the men mended their gear, patched their boots, repaired sleds, and read the same battered book again by the light of tallow. They understood something modern people often resist. Not every moment can be maximized. The economy of effort meant knowing when to let things lie fallow, whether it was land, body, or ambition. And sometimes it meant accepting that comfort wasn't the goal at all. Take the cabins themselves. Small, smoky, often leaky. No one built them to impress anyone. They were simply the right size for survival. Just enough space to sleep, cook, and dry clothes. Anything more was waste. It's a fascinating thought, really. That comfort was considered suspicious. Too much softness dulled your edge. Too much ease made you careless. So, the mountain men cultivated a kind of deliberate roughness. Not suffering exactly, but resilience. They learned to live with a certain level of discomfort as normal. Because, as one trapper wrote in his journal, the wilderness don't coddle. And yet, within that hardship, there was something freeing. When everything you own fits on your back or between four log walls, life simplifies. Decisions narrow. You stop wondering what you're missing out on, because there's simply nothing else to want. That's the quiet gift of the economy of effort, the peace that comes when the world is reduced to what's necessary. The mountain men probably never used words like mindfulness or simplicity, but they lived them daily. They didn't hoard or accumulate, because extra meant weight. Weight slowed you down. Even their cabins reflected that thinking. Look inside an old frontier cabin, and you'll find nothing ornamental. No shelves of trinkets, no decorative rugs, no art on the walls. Just function. A bench, a table, a bed, a stove. Everything earned its place. It wasn't aesthetics. It was survival minimalism. And yet, strangely, it's beautiful. The kind of understated beauty that comes from necessity. There's an elegance in efficiency, a symmetry in simplicity. Perhaps that's what we miss now, the poetry of practicality. Think of it this way. A man chopping wood at dawn wasn't thinking about legacy or meaning. He was thinking about heat. But somewhere in that repetitive, pragmatic motion, meaning arose anyway. He swung the axe because he had to. But the rhythm, the focus, the sound of blade against bark, it built a meditative calm. Sometimes the most meaningful actions are the most mundane. There's another part of the economy of effort that's rarely mentioned. Knowing what to let go of entirely. The mountain men were, by necessity, ruthless editors of their own lives. If something broke beyond repair, they abandoned it. If a trail led nowhere, they turned back. If a plan failed, they didn't dwell on it. They just moved on. They had no audience to perform resilience for, no one to admire their endurance. They simply did what needed doing next. That kind of emotional economy is almost alien today. We're used to reflection, analysis, storytelling. They didn't have that luxury. Their version of moving on was literal. Pack the gear, shoulder the load, keep walking. You can learn a lot from that level of detachment. Not the cold, unfeeling kind, but the gentle acceptance that not everything can be fixed and not everything needs to be. Sometimes a half-finished cabin was enough. Sometimes a failed season was just a season. They understood cycles, that things come and go, that sometimes a forest gives, and sometimes it doesn't. The economy of effort was never about efficiency in the modern sense. It wasn't about productivity. It was about sustainability, not burning out your body, your firewood, or your faith. In that sense, it was more spiritual than practical. To survive meant to live in proportion to your strength, to your environment, to the time of year. They lived in a constant awareness that every resource was finite, the trees, the daylight, even their own breath in the thin mountain air. And so, they learned to measure each thing by its true cost. That's the piece of wisdom that feels most relevant now. Because in our own way, we're surrounded by abundance but drained by it. We spend energy endlessly on things that don't feed us. We've forgotten how to pause before crossing our own line of exhaustion. Maybe that's why stories of the mountain men feel oddly comforting. They remind us that peace doesn't come from having more. It comes from needing less. When you pare life down to essentials, when you stop measuring worth by accumulation, the world gets quieter. You notice the rhythm of your own days again. And maybe in a strange, unintended way, that's what the old log cabins still teach us. Balance. Not the grand, philosophical kind, but the humble sort that comes from knowing exactly how much effort something deserves. Because the truth is, we can't fix everything. We can't finish everything. But we can keep the fire steady. And that was enough. So next time you see a picture of a weathered cabin tucked into the pines, remember, that structure wasn't built for beauty or comfort. It was built for balance, for the quiet mathematics of enough. Every axe mark, every notch, every soot stain tells the same story. Someone once learned the limits of their own strength and still chose to stay. That's the real legacy of the mountain men. Not heroism, not ruggedness, but proportion. And it's something we could all stand to relearn. We like to picture them alone. A single figure against a frozen horizon, beard stiff with frost, coat patched with hide. The image is so clean, so cinematic, that we forget something obvious. Nobody survives that kind of life entirely alone. The wilderness was harsh, and the mountain men, for all their pride and self-reliance, understood that every man needed someone sometimes. They had a word for it, though they didn't say it often, neighbors. Not in the cozy, modern sense of someone living a few feet away, but in the sense of someone existing within a week's travel, ready to trade or lend a hand if disaster struck. You might go months without seeing your neighbor, but you knew he was there, somewhere over the ridge, tending his own little kingdom of wood and smoke. And that was enough. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, you catch the faintest thread of wood smoke from his chimney. Proof of life. A small, invisible reassurance that you weren't the only soul trying to outlast the winter. That's how community worked back then. Not in gatherings or markets, but in awareness. A sense of others moving quietly through the same silence. If a man didn't come down the trail after the thaw, others would notice. Someone would check his cabin, not out of duty, but recognition, because everyone knew how close loneliness came to disaster. And that's another thing we forget. Isolation was a tool, not a punishment. The mountain men valued it because it sharpened their senses and tested their resilience. But they also knew too much of it could unravel you. There are old accounts of trappers talking to their fires, naming their rifles, carving faces into it just to have company. Solitude could make you wise, but it could also make you strange. So, every so often they gathered. In the small clearings that became trading posts at the rendezvous where fur companies exchanged pelts of goods, or sometimes just by accident, meeting another traveler on a narrow trail. And when they did, something softened. The same men who could go weeks without speaking would suddenly turn talkative, swapping stories, exaggerating hunts, laughing in low, rasping bursts that sounded almost like relief. It wasn't the kind of social life we'd recognize, but it was enough to remind them they were human. A strange kind of generosity existed among them, too. Because everyone knew how fragile survival was, they shared easily. Food, tobacco, a spark from the fire. It was unspoken currency. Hospitality in the wilderness wasn't optional. If someone came to your cabin, you fed them before asking their name. You didn't need to like them. You just needed to recognize the look in their eyes. That blend of fatigue and gratitude only the forest could carve into a man. It's an etiquette that feels almost ancient now. We've replaced generosity with transaction and presence with message notifications. But in the old days, hospitality wasn't a choice. It was insurance. A single act of kindness could mean the difference between life and death when storms came or provisions ran low. So you share what you had. And because of that, an invisible community formed. Not bound by fences or law, but by quiet acts of decency repeated over generations. That's the ghost of company the mountain men lived with, not constant, not loud, but steady. Sometimes it was just the sound of an axe echoing faintly across a valley. Sometimes it was a trail of boot prints in the snow that let you know someone else had passed this way before. Even when you didn't see them, they were there, a handful of other stubborn souls scattered to the pines, each holding up their little corner of existence. And though they might never have said it, there must have been comfort in that. It's funny, in a quiet way, that even the most solitary lives find ways to brush against others. Maybe it's a reflex of the human condition, the need to leave traces. You see it in the carvings on cabin beams, initials cut into wood. You see it in the old journals, where men who had no one to talk to still wrote every evening, as if expecting some invisible reader in the future. And here we are, reading them. In a way, their wish came true. There's something humbling about that a man, sitting alone in a cabin 200 years ago, might have written a line like, "The wolves were close tonight, but the fire held," never knowing someone centuries later would nod at those words and understand. That's community too. A bridge through time instead of space. The mountain men were part of a lineage of loneliness. Generations of people who made peace with solitude without ever fully surrendering to it. They lived alone, but never outside the human story. They traded, they shared, they remembered names. They had favorite routes and meeting spots. The bend in the river, the flat stone by the ford, the particular tree where two trails crossed. Places where paths intersected just long enough for a few words and a handshake. And that's another thing about isolation. It made every encounter meaningful. You didn't waste words. When you met someone in the wild, you paid attention. Today, surrounded by constant chatter, we've lost the scarcity of conversation. But the mountain men, they savored it. A single shared story could echo for weeks afterward, repeated to the fire like prayer. When they built cabins, they often built them near water or clearings where others might one day pass. Not out of vanity, they didn't expect visitors, but out of habit, as if the act of being findable, even faintly, was part of the moral code of survival. You didn't vanish completely. You left signs, cut logs stacked neatly, ashes cleared, traps marked, trails blazed. A language of small kindnesses that said, someone lives here, someone cares. Even their graves followed that logic. Out in the hills, when a man died, his companions would mark the spot with a crude cross or pile of stones. Sometimes they'd carve a few words, sometimes just initials. It wasn't elaborate. It was simply acknowledgement, a message to anyone who passed. He was here. And isn't that all any of us really want? In the end, to be seen, even faintly, to leave a trace. The mountain men did that without even trying. Every cabin foundation, every trail worn through underbrush, every page of a weathered journal. They left fingerprint of a kind of loneliness that wasn't sad, but serene. They didn't flee society. They simply built a smaller, quieter version of it. Their version of friendship might have been infrequent, but it was durable. You could go a year without seeing someone. And when you finally did, there was no awkwardness, just recognition. The simple, wordless kind that comes when you've both been through the same storms. That's what made their bond strong. Not constant contact, but shared endurance. They didn't talk much about feelings or fears. They just helped each other patch roofs, traded pelts or powder, and shared a cup of bitter coffee boiled too long over the fire. You can almost imagine the scene. Two men in threadbare coats, hunched against the wind, not saying much, just existing in the same quiet. No one trying to impress the other. No need to fill the silence. That was friendship in its purest form, the kind that doesn't need words to confirm itself. And maybe in that sense, their solitude was never really isolation. It was spaciousness, room enough to breathe, to think, to build, to be. They weren't running from humanity. They were distilling it. When you live far from crowds, you learn what truly matters in company. Not conversation, but presence. And that's something worth remembering now, in a world so full of noise. Maybe we don't need more communication. Maybe we just need better silences shared between us. The mountain men knew that silence well, the kind that isn't empty but full of the world's own small sounds. The crackle of fire, the distant rush of wind through pine, the soft scrape of a knife against wood. In those moments, even alone, they were surrounded by the memory of others, by the marks of those who came before, by the faint echo of humanity carried on the smoke. And perhaps that's the most comforting thought of all, that no one ever truly lives alone. Not if they leave something behind. Not if they listen closely enough to the whispers of those who came before. So tonight, as we drift down toward the end of this quiet journey, remember this. Solitude doesn't mean absence. Sometimes it just means space for something gentler to exist. Respect, patience, connection without noise. And if you've ever felt alone in your own small cabin, surrounded by the hum of the modern world, you already understand them better than you think. We're all, in one way or another, mountain men now, trying to build something sturdy out of silence. If you could step into one of their old cabins today, you'd probably feel it before you saw it. That quiet weight of time. The smell of dust and with smoke that never quite leaves. The faint draft through gaps that once held moss or clay. Maybe the outline of a bed, the suggestion of a hearth, the ghost of a life that was once warm and ordinary. The logs would be silvered now, the bark long gone, the roof sagging slightly, leaning under the years. The forest would have grown around it, folding it back into itself. You might not even notice it until you were almost upon it. A shape half swallowed by trees, patient and dignified. Step inside, and you'd find it empty, of course, but not hollow. There's something quietly human about the remains of an old cabin, the way the floorboards still creak, even though no one's walked there in a century, the way the corners collect leaves, as if the wind remembers where the door once was. You can almost imagine the life that happened there. The long winters, the mornings when smoke rose early, the boots left drying by the fire. And maybe, if you stand there long enough, you start to realize that what the mountain men built wasn't just shelter. It was a conversation with time. Each cabin was a kind of agreement. I'll stay here for a while, and when I'm gone, you, the forest, the wind, the earth, can take it back. That humility, that acceptance of impermanence, is maybe the most profound thing they left behind, because they never built to last forever. They built to last long enough. And somehow, that was enough. We're used to the idea that permanence equals success, that what we make should endure unchanged. But the mountain men knew better. The forest always wins in the end, and they didn't fight it. They worked with it, knowing it would reclaim what was borrowed. There's something beautifully realistic about that. The quiet knowledge that everything, even the strongest logs, will one day soften and sink. But here's the thing. When the cabin falls, it doesn't vanish. It becomes something else. The logs turn to soil. The roof turns to moss. The hearth crumbles back into stone. Nothing is wasted. That's what they understood. The world doesn't erase what we build. It transforms it. And maybe that's the truest kind of immortality. If you look at where those cabins once stood, you'll find new trees growing straight out of the old walls. The forest doesn't reject the past. It grows through it. In a way, the mountain men never left. Their fingerprints are in the wood that became the next generation of forest. Their ashes are in the soil. Their paths are still faintly visible beneath the underbrush. Even the stories of their lives, the journals, the letters, the rumors, have taken on that same slow, natural rhythm. They fade, resurface, change shape. It's easy to think of them as rough and primitive, men with no poetry in their souls. But when you look closely, you see something deeply poetic in the way they lived, a quiet surrender to cycles. They didn't conquer nature, they collaborated with it. Every log cut, every fire lit, every mile walked, it was all part of a rhythm older than themselves. And when the time came to leave, they didn't make monuments. They left cabins that would fall gently, without complaint. We could learn from that. Because if there's one thing the modern world has forgotten, it's how to let things fade gracefully. We chase longevity, preservation, legacy, as if the only way to prove we existed is to outlast our own time. But maybe it's enough to exist well while we're here. To build carefully, use wisely, and let go when the season turns. That was the mountain men's philosophy, whether they meant it or not. They built, they lived, and when the forest whispered it was time, they moved on. Their cabins became ruins. Their ruins became forest. Their stories became ours. And isn't that the most natural form of legacy there is? It's tempting to imagine what they'd think of us now, surrounded by noise, by constant light, by houses built to never decay. Would they envy us or pity us? Maybe a little of both. They might find our comforts excessive, our noise exhausting. They might shake their heads at how far we've drifted from the rhythms that kept them alive. But they'd probably understand, too, because at the heart of it, our needs are the same as theirs. Warmth, shelter, connection, a sense of enough. We've just buried those needs under layers of complexity. The mountain men stripped all that away, often by necessity. What remained was the simple equation of living. Build what you need, mend what you break, rest when you're tired, share when you can. And in that simplicity, they found peace, or at least the closest thing to it the wilderness allows. That's the part of their story that feels like a lullaby now. The slow, unhurried wisdom of lives measured not in progress, but in presence. No noise, no rush, just a steady rhythm of wood, wind, and fire. And maybe that's why even now their cabins draw us in. We see pictures of them, half collapsed, surrounded by golden leaves, and something inside us softens. We feel nostalgia for a life we never lived, a quiet we've never known. Because somewhere deep down, we remember what they knew. That peace doesn't come from perfection. It comes from rhythm, from small, steady acts done with care. Maybe that's why the image of a cabin in the woods feels like home, even to people who've never left the city. It's the dream of balance between solitude and connection, work and rest, nature and shelter. A reminder that you don't need to conquer the world to belong in it. You just need to listen. Listen to the wind against the logs, the fire settling, the world turning quietly on its axis. That's what the mountain men did night after night. And in that stillness, they built not just cabins, but understanding. They knew that being small isn't failure. It's grace. That every act of creation is also an act of surrender. That the truest wisdom lies not in control, but in cooperation. It's a strange comfort, the thought that even the most rugged men found peace and gentleness. That even the hardest lives carried an undercurrent of calm. Maybe that's why their story lulls us to sleep now, because it hums with the same slow truth we crave, that the world is not ours to master, only to join. So let's leave them here in their quiet mountains. Let the fire burn low, the smoke drift out through the cracks, the snow begin to fall against the roof. Somewhere an old cabin stands beneath 1,000 stars, its timbers creaking softly in the cold. And inside there's still warmth, faint, steady, eternal enough. If you've stayed awake through this long, drowsy journey, thank you for keeping company by the fire. If you've drifted off somewhere between the logs and the smoke, well, that's perfectly fine too. That's what this story was meant for. If you enjoyed our slow wander through history tonight, leave a quiet note below. Tell me what you'd build if you could. A cabin, a fire, a little piece of your own. And if you haven't already, consider liking, subscribing, and joining again next time, where we'll drift into another piece of forgotten history, one meant to be listened to slowly, with the lights low and the world far away. Until then, rest well. Good night. Crescent moon fire.